Two women working in secret, often after midnight, going through spreadsheets nobody else was supposed to see. That's how the largest accounting fraud in American history got caught, not by regulators, not by Wall Street analysts, but by the company's own internal auditor, Cynthia Cooper, and a small team who quietly discovered nearly $4 billion in accounting entries that shouldn't have existed. By the time the full picture emerged, that number would grow to $11 billion. An entire telecommunications giant, once worth more than $180 billion, built partly on a lie about basic bookkeeping. The man at the top was Bernard Ebbers, a former gym teacher and motel owner, turned telecom billionaire, known for wearing cowboy boots and jeans to boardrooms full of suits. He'd built WorldCom from a tiny long-distance reseller into a company that nearly swallowed the entire American phone industry. He'd eventually be sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. This is the story of how one company hid a financial collapse in plain sight, using an accounting trick simple enough to explain in one sentence, and how it all came undone because a handful of employees refused to stop asking questions. Bernard Ebbers wasn't a Wall Street insider. Before WorldCom, he'd coached basketball, managed a garment distributor, and run a chain of motels. In 1983, he helped start a tiny long-distance telephone reseller in Mississippi, originally called Long Distance Discount Services. It shouldn't have worked. The long-distance telecom business in the 1980s and 90s was already crowded with giants. But Ebbers had one strategy, and he ran it relentlessly. Acquisitions. Buy smaller competitors, roll them into the company, use the growing size to justify a rising stock price, then use that rising stock price to buy the next competitor. Over and over. By 1995, the company had rebranded as WorldCom. In 1998, it pulled off its biggest move yet, a $47 billion acquisition of MCI, at the time the second largest long-distance carrier in the country. WorldCom was now a genuine telecommunications giant, and Bernard Ebbers, the cowboy boot-wearing former gym teacher, was one of the most powerful executives in American business. Then came the early 2000s and the dot-com crash. Demand for network capacity, which WorldCom had bet its entire growth strategy on, collapsed. The stock price that had fueled a decade of acquisitions started falling, and for a company built almost entirely on the promise of that rising stock, a falling one wasn't just bad news. It threatened to unravel everything. Wall Street expected WorldCom to keep hitting its numbers. Ebbers had personally borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars against his own WorldCom stock to fund side investments. A ranch in Canada, a yacht-building company, timberland. If the stock price dropped too far, he could face margin calls he couldn't cover. The pressure to keep the numbers looking good wasn't abstract. It was personal, and it went straight to the top. Here's the accounting mechanism at the heart of the fraud, and it really is this simple. WorldCom, like every telecom company, had to pay other network operators for access to their lines when a call traveled outside WorldCom's own network. These payments were called line costs, and under normal accounting rules, they're an ordinary operating expense. You pay them, you subtract them from revenue that quarter, and whatever's left is your profit. Starting around 1999, under the direction of Chief Financial Officer Scott Sullivan, WorldCom began quietly reclassifying billions of dollars of these ordinary operating expenses as something else entirely: capital expenditures. On paper, that's the difference between buying office supplies and buying a building. A building is an investment. Its cost gets spread out, or capitalized over many years instead of hitting profits all at once. There was nothing being invested in. These were the exact same routine network access bills WorldCom paid every quarter. Sullivan's team was simply moving them to a different line on the balance sheet, where they wouldn't count against current profits. The effect was almost magical, in the way all accounting fraud eventually is. WorldCom's actual business was struggling, revenue growth was slowing, real profitability was cratering. But the numbers reported to investors kept showing a healthy, profitable company, quarter after quarter. Internal accountants were directed to make these entries with no legitimate business justification, entries senior executives would later admit had no basis in standard accounting rules at all. Wall Street kept believing it. The stock, for a while, kept climbing on the back of numbers that simply weren't real. The fraud might have continued for years, if not for Cynthia Cooper, WorldCom's vice president of internal audit, and, notably, someone who'd grown up in the same small Mississippi community that took immense pride in the company. In the spring of 2002, Cooper and a small team began quietly investigating unusual capital expenditure entries, initially not entirely sure what they were looking for. What they found, working largely in secret and often late at night to avoid drawing attention, was staggering. Nearly $4 billion in accounting entries with no clear business justification. When Cooper brought her concerns to other WorldCom executives, she didn't get answers. She got resistance. The company's controller told her she was wasting her time and should focus her audit elsewhere. The chairman of the audit committee told her not to press for documentation and to simply wait for CFO Scott Sullivan to explain it to her himself. Cooper didn't wait. She and her colleague Glyn Smith kept digging, building out a detailed picture, quarter by quarter, of exactly how the entries had been made and how large the discrepancy really was. On June 20th, 2002, Cooper and Smith presented their full findings directly to WorldCom's audit committee in Washington, D.C., with Scott Sullivan himself in the room. Days later, Sullivan was fired. On June 25th, 2002, WorldCom went public with the news. It had discovered $3.8 billion in fraudulent accounting entries. This was less than a year after Enron's collapse had already shaken American confidence in corporate accounting. WorldCom's announcement landed like a second earthquake in the same fault line, and as investigators dug further, the number kept growing. What started as $3.8 billion would eventually be revealed as roughly $11 billion in misstated earnings across multiple years. On July 21st, 2002, WorldCom filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, at the time the largest corporate bankruptcy in United States history, eclipsing even Enron's just months earlier. A company once valued at over $180 billion had come apart in a matter of weeks. The human cost was immense and immediate. Thousands of WorldCom employees lost their jobs. Many had also held company stock in retirement accounts, watching those savings evaporate as the stock price collapsed to essentially nothing. Investors, pension funds, and ordinary shareholders who had trusted WorldCom's reported earnings lost a combined total in the tens of billions of dollars. Investigators worked to reconstruct exactly how the fraud had operated and who had known what. It became clear the deception hadn't stayed confined to the executive suite. Lower-level accounting staff had been directly instructed to make entries they knew didn't reflect reality, told simply to hit the numbers with little room to push back against direct orders from superiors. The public and legal reckoning was just beginning. The Justice Department pursued WorldCom's former executives aggressively, and the case moved through federal court over the following years. Scott Sullivan, the CFO who had directed the fraudulent entries, pleaded guilty and, critically, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, becoming the government's star witness against his former boss. In his testimony, Sullivan told the court that Ebbers had repeatedly instructed him to hit the numbers, pressuring him to find ways to make the company's results match Wall Street's expectations, whatever it took. On July 13, 2005, a jury found Bernard Ebbers guilty on all counts: securities fraud, conspiracy, and multiple counts of filing false statements with regulators. Ebbers, 63 years old, at sentencing and dealing with heart problems, wept in the courtroom as the judge announced his sentence: 25 years in federal prison, one of the harshest sentences ever handed down in a corporate fraud case, effectively a life sentence given his age. Scott Sullivan, in exchange for his cooperation, received a considerably lighter sentence: 5 years. Several other WorldCom employees down the chain of command were also sentenced, including Comptroller David Myers and Accounting Director Buford Yates, and even a lower-level accounting manager named Betty Vinson, who had made some of the fraudulent entries under direct pressure from her superiors, received 5 months in prison and 5 months of house arrest, a stark illustration of how far down the organization the fraud's fingerprints reached. Ebbers served just over 13 years of his 25-year sentence. In late 2019, with his health rapidly deteriorating and, according to court filings, an estimated 18 months left to live, a federal judge granted him compassionate release. He died at his home in Mississippi on February 2, 2020, just over a month after walking out of prison, surrounded by his family. The scandal's legacy extended well beyond the individuals involved. Alongside Enron, WorldCom's collapse directly drove Congress to pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, landmark legislation that for the first time required CEOs and CFOs to personally certify the accuracy of their company's financial statements under threat of criminal liability if they knowingly signed off on fraud. What makes WorldCom different from some of the other frauds in this series is how mundane the actual mechanism was. There was no fake blood testing machine, no manufactured spreadsheet of imaginary customers, just a routine business expense moved to the wrong line of a balance sheet, repeated quarter after quarter at a scale that eventually reached $11 billion. It's almost more unsettling for that simplicity. Enron's fraud involved famously complex financial instruments most people still can't fully explain. WorldCom's fraud could be explained on a napkin, and it still fooled Wall Street for years, until a small internal audit team in Mississippi refused to accept vague answers to a straightforward question. If you haven't seen it yet, go check out our video on Enron, the fraud that broke just months before this one, and help set the stage for exactly the kind of scrutiny that eventually caught WorldCom. And subscribe, because next up in this series, we're looking at a fraud dressed up as innovation, Nikola Motors, and the truck that famously rolled downhill.